Good evening, friends. Thank you for coming back. It's always encouraging. Um, I think there will be others still coming, but for the sake of you who have made it on time, I'd like just to get started. And this evening, we are considering Creeds, Councils and Controversies, which some of you will already recognise as a title of an important book that's brought together all sorts of uh, little extracts and important pieces of documents. So if you've done any church history, you've come across this before, but we are looking specifically at some of the history of the way in which in the first 200-300 years people were trying to sort out what the church was about, how to do things, and particularly today we're going to think about how what it actually believed and how it managed to phrase what it was, what was at the heart of its faith. Because finding the language proved to be quite difficult, as people were struggling either to redefine terms that folk already knew or to invent new terms. So a lot of what we're going to do today is around that kind of struggle, how the language worked. But we ended up last week having looked at the way in which the church had defined its edges and its centre, what its boundaries were. So what was the faith that was acceptable and what was at the heart, what held the church together. And that was focusing around particular teachings and particular teachers. And we talked about defending and defining how the church reacted under pressure and what kind of discipline was put into place when people didn't live within the structures of the faith, particularly those who had betrayed their faith or had apostatized. And we also touched briefly on interacting and contrasting with existing philosophies. We'll be doing a bit more of that today, but how the church or different thinkers either reacted to or rejected the philosophical concepts that people around them were taking for granted and were using. So today we are going to look at that's taken me a bit further on than I meant to go. Today we're going to look at what happened when persecution ended, because what we were looking at last week was a lot of ways in which the church was either facing persecution head on or dealing with the consequences of persecution or living with the threat of persecution. A major shift came in 312 when Constantine became emperor. And then the church had to figure out how to live with an emperor who appeared to be on their side. Constantine didn't become emperor just by virtue of birth or woke up one morning and there was the announcement, the emperor is dead, long live the emperor. He had to fight to achieve it. And that's important in the way in which he interacts with the church. The emperor died. Constantine was one of the candidates, and there were others, and there were various battles and alliances and struggles to who was going to have supreme power. And in 312, Constantine won the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which is just outside Rome. And this was the major battle. This was the one that finally defeated all of the other, well, most of the others who were possible contenders to be the emperor. And as a result of him winning this battle, everything changed for the church. Because what happened at this battle, or just before the battle, was that he had a vision. Back up, Ruth, I should have checked. The handout came for everybody in the body of the email that came from Eventbrite today. So you should all have that handout. And in it, I've got various quotations, which is why I'm just pausing here, because there are two quotations in that handout that refer to the vision that Constantine had before this battle, because there are two versions of the story. The first one from a man called Lactantius is the earliest one that's written down, and then the second one was written by Eusebius, who is a bishop, and later on writes a life of Constantine, in which he really portrays Constantine as some kind of gift of God to the church, almost as a 13th apostle, really. And it's as a result of what happens following this battle. the just you can see that the coins here. That's the side with the head of the unconquered sun, but the other side shows what's known as the labarum, and there are various. This is only ever described, and there are various visions of it. That's one. The coin shows one side, so it's a standard that people took into battle. So you see this sort of pole on which the standard goes, and here is the standard, and this is what's called the Chi-Rho. So it's an X with what looks like a P. It's a Greek R through the center of it. First two letters of the name Christ. That's one way in which the what he saw in his vision is portrayed. The other is this one here, which is the labarum below the Chi-Rho, and the three medallions, which in other presentations of it are his sons. So his sort of people he was taking with him. Now he has this vision, and it may have been a vision that Eusebius calls it, that says that he saw the trophy of the cross above the sun. So he was awake, he was looking up into the sky, he saw the sun, and up above the sun he saw this, whatever it was. Lactantius says that it was in a dream that the vision came to him, but both of them have. There was the Chi-Rho was involved. It was a labarum. It was a sign to take into battle, and the phrase "in hoc signo vincit," in this vinces, in this sign you will conquer. And so the link is made between the Chi-Rho, the vision, you will conquer in this sign, and then he goes on and wins the battle. And so whatever the actual story of the vision is, certainly this becomes for Constantine his recognition that the God whom the Christians name has given him a sign that he is going to win the battle. He then goes on and wins the battle because he uses the sign that this God has given him. Now, it's not just as straightforward as Constantine becomes a Christian and goes and wins the battle, because it's actually quite difficult to work out what Constantine's own religious views are. But it is certainly true that following the battle, he doesn't exactly side with the church, but he certainly stops persecuting it, and he begins to offer it some support and some freedoms that it hadn't had before. Constantine had been brought up to worship the unconquered sun, as in S-U-N. So the link between the vision over the sun and his childhood faith isn't to be discounted. But the faith in the unconquered sun, Sol Invictus, was a monotheistic faith. So there was a sort of crossover for him, slightly different from the traditional Roman religion. But what is certainly clear, regardless of what his actual views were, and they'd certainly changed through his life, is that he didn't only cease to persecute the church, he began to favour it. In 313, so the year after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he issued the Edict of Milan, and this allowed liberty of religion. Now that was for everybody, not just for Christians, liberty of religion, but he also returned the property to the church that had been taken by Domitian in the persecution. There were still pagan symbols on the coins, and you can see that on the previous slide. You've still got the sort of Sol Invictus here, still got the pagan symbols. So he hadn't kind of thrown out all of the keeping the pagans on side as well. The triumphal arch that he put up in Rome to mark his success and his coming into the emperorship had no Christian symbols on it. It had pagan symbols on it. But he also became a patron, a guardian of the church. He gave money so that the church could begin to put up buildings, and we begin to get quite a significant building of what we would call churches, and congregations now meeting in dedicated buildings rather than in homes. He granted tax privileges to priests. He promoted Christians to powerful positions in his government, and he founded Constantinople. Now, that was a political move. He wanted to move away from Rome. He wanted to move the centre of the empire to the east, because he was more at home there, and he had more support there. But what's significant about Constantinople is it had no pagan temples, and it did have Christian churches. He founded it as a Christian city. And the column that he put up there to celebrate it is very much a Christian, has Christian symbols on it. And the coins that were struck to mark the founding of the city have the cross on them, and are using Christian symbology. He also he abolished crucifixion as a punishment, and he made Sunday a day of rest, though it was also the day that was dedicated to the sun, given the name. So that wasn't just a Christian thing. He began to institute more care for prisoners, and he banned gladiatorial games. So he did various things that were certainly in line with what you might want to call Christian values, and certainly what Christians have been arguing for. Banning the gladiatorial games, they were very keen on, because they'd suffered a lot in that. He wasn't actually baptized. He was eventually baptized, but only as he was about to die. Now, this was not uncommon, and this is partly because there was a very strong tradition that post-baptismal sin either couldn't be forgiven at all, or could only be forgiven after great penance. And so quite a lot of people put off baptism until quite late on in order to avoid that. And also, as emperor, he felt he was being caught in situations where there weren't, how do you behave as a Christian and an emperor? Nobody had done it before. And things like not murdering, and behaving honestly, and so on, were the high level of morality that was being required of new converts was something that he felt as emperor he couldn't do. So that was another reason why he put it off. I have just a little bit of fun for you as a way of remembering what he actually achieved. This is assuming this works. Oh, let me just... It occurs to me I need to, if I'm going to share this, I need to share the sound as well. Now, I guarantee you'll have that tune running through your head for the rest of the evening. But it's a bit of, it's accurate, but it's just a bit of fun to help you grasp something of what was going on with Constantine. And you will have heard there, just at the very beginning, mention of the Council of Nicaea, because Constantine was significant not just in terms of ending persecution and supporting the church. Note, please, this is not when Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. That doesn't happen until 380 under Theodosius. But Constantine is decisive, not just politically or socially or financially for the church, but also doctrinally. And that brings us on to the first of our controversies for this evening, which is the discussion around Arius and Arianism, which leads to the Council of Nicaea. The dominant philosophy of the time is Neoplatonism, and at the heart of the Neoplatonic thinking was the conviction that being, the ultimate being, was separate from creation, from physical reality. So the one, the being, the centre of all that is, was separate from and distanced from physical reality, creation, nature, humanity, whatever you want to call it. And this had been adopted by some Christian thinkers, particularly as a way of how to speak about Jesus, as they began to explore all of that. The Bishop of Alexandria preached about Jesus as divine, 318, we are now, 318. The Bishop of Alexandria preached about Jesus as the divine one, the divine presence. He was preaching about incarnation. Arius, who was one of the priests in the city, objected to this because he argued that to treat Jesus as divine was to go down the road of tritheism, three-godness, because you had God the Father, and now he was saying you had a separate God who was Jesus, and that you couldn't do this. The oneness, the being, the center of all things must be one, because that is perfection. And so to claim divinity for Jesus was to move in the direction of tritheism. Now, little of Arius' own writings have survived because he lost the battle, and he lost the major part of the battle, and of course, therefore, most of his writings were destroyed, though some of them have survived. But one of the things that he claimed, that he's reported as having claimed, is saying, the Father begot the Son. He was begotten and had a beginning. Therefore, there was when he was not. And that's the key phrase, there was when he was not. So the Son is not eternal. And this is what Arius started preaching to object to his bishop, and others in the city were discomforted by what he preached, and they wrote to the bishop to object, and the debates raged, and there were divisions not just in Alexandria, but it spread throughout, particularly the Greek-speaking part of the church. The story was that you couldn't go in and get your hair cut until you agreed with whatever the barber said about the nature of the Son. It was being debated in the hairdressers and on the bars and the street corners, and sometimes the debates got very heated. Because at the centre of this debate are issues to do with salvation. How are we saved? What does it mean to be saved? So the basic story was there was creation. Creation went into decay, which was identified with Adam and with the fall. And God then united God's own self with creation in order to renew and save it. But if Arius is right, then there are some questions around this. For example, if Christ is begotten and not eternal, and therefore is creaturely, can he save? Can a creature bridge that gap between the divine and the created? And if a creature can bridge that gap, then what's so special about, why do we need Jesus? If he is one of the creatures, if he is part of this, if you imagine the division, if he's part of the side that's the created order, and if he can bridge the gap, then anyone can, and if he can't bridge the gap, then he can't save us. You see where this argument's going? This is the argument against Arius. This is what people were, they heard him speak, and this was the kind of question that they were coming up with. And there were sub-questions as well around that. Should Jesus be worshipped, or is that idolatry? Because what was happening, of course, in worship services, and we saw it last time when we heard Pliny's report, was that they worship Christ as a god. So was this idolatry if he isn't divine the way the Father is divine? And what does it do to the liturgy? People are baptized into the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. People are blessed in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. What happens if there's this impassable divide between divinity and humanity? And what happened is there is a huge division. There is argument not just in Alexandria, but across the whole of the church. There are people lining up on every side, that it looks as if instead of one Roman Holy Catholic Church, which that's a phrase that we're not being used yet, but one church, instead of one church, we're going to have a split church. And Constantine doesn't want this. Because one of the reasons why Constantine has wanted to support and care for the church is it is a unifying power throughout the empire. If you remember back when we were talking about persecution, we were talking about the way in which sometimes the persecutions happened because the emperor, they were consequential rather than directly intentional, because the emperor was trying to hold the empire together. Well, Constantine is going to use the church to do that. Except, of course, it's not going to work if the church is falling out. And so he calls a council. Council of Nicaea, 325, very significant date. It's not actually the first council he's called. He called one in early on, just after he'd come into power, because there was still the split over what to do with those who had apostatized, whether they were allowed back into the church or not. And he sort of brought people together to try and get that sorted out. But this is a really important council. It actually addresses several issues. They sort out the date for Easter. They're talking still about what to do with those who are lapsed, and about penitents and how to get them back into the church, and also what to do with those who have become, and we're beginning to use this language now, become heretical. If they then repent and want to become orthodox, do they have to go through a certain level of penitence? But they call this council, and the main thing that they are trying to deal with is this debate around Arius' theology. It happens in Turkey. The town is called Nicaea. It was now called Izmir. Happens in Turkey because partly because it's possible to get there. People from various different places are able to get there. There is a letter where Constantine is explaining the council, and he said one of the good things about having it in Nicaea, it's called in May, is because the weather's good. I mean, literally that's an issue. And of course, people are having to travel, walk or travel on horseback or in carts, so they want good weather for it. And also Constantine can get there. It's quite close to Constantinople. Delegates come from across the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, where the church has also been growing. There are about 1,800 people who come. Bishops, priests and deacons. They're offered free travel and board to get there. It's mainly folk from the eastern part of the empire, mainly Greek speaking. There were about 5 Latin speaking bishops who were there, plus their entourages, but it's mainly Greek speaking. Constantine is very visible towards the end of the council. He's not there at the very beginning. It lasts for about a month. He's very visible towards the end, and he presided over it. He by the time he's there, it is running more or less along the lines of the Roman Senate. It's sort of taken up that model of speechifying and debating. So the main issue is Arius' teaching. Is it compatible with the church's historic teaching? We're just beginning to use the language of heresy here, so we have to be careful when we're talking about the council, not to say that this is orthodoxy versus heresy. This is actually about trying to define what is orthodox and what is heretical, or what is, probably better phrased, what is in line with the handed-on tradition and what has moved outside of it. That's what's actually being debated at this point. Is what's being taught moving in the right direction? About a month of debate. There is one of the bishops who attends is Nicholas of Myra, who eventually becomes known as St. Nicholas and eventually becomes known as Santa Claus. And he was very much on the side of those who rejected Arius. Hence this little meme that appears every Christmas now. He is reputed to have punched Arius. He probably didn't, but the level of anger and the level of passion that was felt in this debate, that's what that story kind of refers to. The debate and the terms in which it was carried out were in Greek. Now remember, not everybody was Greek speaking, so that becomes an issue in itself. But the debate was carried out in terms of trying to discuss what was meant by born, what is meant by created, what is meant by begotten. Do these mean the same thing? Do these mean different things? How are they to be understood? And it's getting nowhere. People are struggling. The sides they're not equally balanced. There are more against Arius than for him, but it's not decisive yet. And it looks as if it's going to end in deadlock or go on for a long time. And Constantine takes a hand. He needs this sorted out. Now, the solution which they come up with, which Constantine puts forward, and it's therefore very difficult to reject, probably doesn't come directly from Constantine himself. He's not that good a theologian, though he's a pretty good theologian. But he's advised by a man called Hosius of Cordoba, who was, let's just show you where Nicaea is. Hosius suggests to him a term that is not scriptural, and that's one of the reasons why there are those who resist it, but which does become central to the creed and has remained central to the great tradition of the church. And that is the term Homo Uscios. You'll find it on the handout, I think. It's certainly supposed to be on the handout. Homo Uscios, H-O-M-O O-U-S-I-O-S. That is, of like substance. The same substance. The other side, the Arian side, argued for the term Homo Uscios. Homo Uscios. Sorry, I'm looking at the transcript, and it's wonderful because it's definitely trying to make sense of this language, which is H-O-M-O-I-O-U-I-S-O-S. Homo Uscios, of similar substance. And this one little letter, iota, is the difference between what becomes defined as the great tradition and what becomes defined as the excluded tradition, the heretical tradition. And if you know the creed, you will recognize this phrase of one substance with the Father, Homo Uscios, as opposed to Homo Uscios of similar. So those who were on the Arian side were arguing Jesus is more like God than anybody else is, but he's not the same as. He is more like God than anything else in all creation, but he's not the same as. Homoi as opposed to homo. And Constantine puts his weight behind Homo Uscios, of same substance. And that was accepted by the majority who were there. Now, there were some who left, so they didn't have to vote. It was very difficult to vote against the emperor. But it was accepted. There were some who objected because it was not scriptural, but they were willing, insofar as we had scripture. The canon of scripture is not yet closed at this point. It's becoming recognized, but it's not finalized. But what the emperor wants, the emperor gets. And so this becomes the phrase. Except, of course, it doesn't in the end, because it doesn't settle it. And what it does is sharply delineate the sides. And there are those who reject it. And the Arian church, the Arian tradition does continue. And in fact, when Constantine is baptized, he is baptized by an Arian bishop. And it is not clear whether he actually changed his mind or whether this was also a political move. That said, this is the origin of the Nicene Creed, which is the creed that unites the entire East and West Church. It doesn't unite the entire church because there is the continuing Arian church. But it's the Nicene Creed, which you will recognize, and I've put on the handout. Better to call it actually the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, which of course we don't because it's far too big a mouthful, because in fact the creed is amended in 381, and I've put on the handout the emendations, and it's largely to do with expanding some of it, adding in words around the Holy Ghost, around church and baptism, and around the resurrection, because as the discussions go on, people realise, okay, we might have found a language to talk about Jesus, but there's still a lot of other stuff we need to do. But basically, when you read the Nicene Creed, what you're reading is something drawn up to counteract Arius, and then extended to tidy up various other things. And the fact that they had to go on and tidy it up and extend it and so on needed to be done again at a council, and shows the need for a new council. In fact, there are 7 councils altogether that are called the Ecumenical Councils. And they're all trying to deal with issues and have unfinished business and trying to tidy it up. Now, not all current Christian traditions accept all 7 councils. And the issue is authority and power. Who gets to call a council and who gets to decide which council has made a definitive statement. So I put on the handout the 7 accepted councils, and I'll just go through them and kind of see how they fit together. So there's Nicaea 325. In 381, there's a council in Constantinople, which again pays attention to the creed and begins to address issues around the Holy Spirit. That one is called by Theodosius I. In 431, Theodosius II calls a council, which is at Ephesus, and that's to deal with an issue around a man called Nestorius. We'll come back to this, but Nestorius claimed that Mary only gave birth to the human man, with whom God then united after his birth. So Mary only gave birth to the human Jesus, and God then united and made him Christ later on. Question, when? That's debated in 431, and then in 451 there is the Council of Chalcedon, which is also dealing with Nestorius and talking about Jesus. We'll come back to this one because it's quite significant. 553, again in Constantinople. We're still trying to find ways of talking about Jesus, and it's dealing with decisions made at Chalcedon and trying to refine them and make them clearer. That's called by the Emperor Justinian. In 680, there's another council at Constantinople, which is to do with the natures of Christ, which again, we touch on with Chalcedon, so we'll come back to that. Again, called by the emperor. And in Nicaea, the 7th one, the final one, 787, called by the Empress Irene. And that's looking at issues to do with iconoclasm. Can you have images in church? Now, the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Roman Catholic Church accept all 7 of these councils. The Church of the East, which is not the same as the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Syriac churches accept only the first 2. The Oriental Orthodox churches, Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopian, and so on, they accept the first 3. And the Lutheran, the Anglican, the Reformed churches accept the first 4. So we could say this is an ecumenical issue. This is still ongoing stuff, and if you get involved in ecumenism at any sort of faith and order level, you'll find that these debates are still going on. Which of the councils have authority and which ones do we take on board and work with? But you can see these are where they all happen. This is all in the eastern part of the empire. That's Constantinople there, so that's the Bosphorus. We're moving over here into Eastern Asia. Okay, so Italy's up here. So they're all taking part in the Greek-speaking part of the church. That's where all this, it's not that there's only Greeks attending, but that's where they're happening. And that's partly because Constantine has moved the centre of the empire to Constantinople, because Rome has become unstable and unsafe, and he wanted a fresh start rather than trying to move. And the emperors who follow him continue in Constantinople. And what's happening in the West is actually the Western Empire is beginning to disintegrate. The Western part of the empire is beginning to disintegrate. I'll say a little bit about Chalcedon in 451. This is revisiting issues around how to speak appropriately of Jesus. Nestorius had affirmed there was one substance. He was Homo Uscios, that was fine. But the church also wanted to say, as well as saying that Christ was of one substance with the Father, they also wanted to say that he was human. And the normal definition of human is strained if you are speaking of a human being who is also a divine being. So there was a lot of effort being put into trying to find a way of speaking about Jesus that was coherent, but also stayed within the tradition. And I've already referred to Nestorius. Nestorius insisted that Mary gave birth to the man Jesus, whom God then indwelt as God had indwelt, for example, Moses, but more so. Nestorius was Bishop of Constantinople. Cyril, who was Bishop of Alexandria, was very distressed by what Nestorius was saying. Now, this was partly to do with the honour that, particularly in Alexandria, was paid to Mary. In Alexandria, one of the favourite titles for Mary was Theotokos, God-bearer. Theo, God, tokos, bearer, carrier. And Cyril felt that Nestorius was undermining this, was attacking this, but also that he was splitting Jesus. He was saying there was a divine bit and there was a human bit, and that somehow these were separate. The Council of Ephesus, so the one that took place in 431, had condemned and deposed Nestorius from his bishopric, but another council that was meeting literally across the road did the same thing to Cyril over this issue. The emperor got involved and arrested both Nestorius and Cyril to get them out of the way. Didn't really fix things because Nestorius eventually died in prison, but Cyril was a very good politician, and he managed to win his way out and back. Eutyches, who was Eutyches. Let me spell Eutyches here. Eutyches. Eutyches, who was an abbot in Constantinople, so in the area of Nestorius. He affirmed that there were two natures in Christ which could be divided. He affirmed that if we said Christ had two natures, that would mean he could be divided, and therefore there must only be one nature. So Christ was, his human nature was fully absorbed into his divine nature. So there was only one nature, and this becomes known as monophysitism. Mono, one, physitism, physite is will. But this also was uncomfortable, and the Alexandrians were unhappy about this because, as far as they could see, if the human nature was fully absorbed into the divine nature, you could no longer speak about Jesus as being human. That didn't make any sense. You were back to the same problem that they'd had. What you need to notice here is this is not just about the theology, it is also about the power between Alexandria and Constantinople. Who has the power? Who is the lead church? Where are the leading theologians speaking from? Who gets to say what is true? Alexandria or Constantinople, or indeed Rome. Rome at this point has lost prestige and power. The centre of the empire has moved, as I've said, and the Western Empire is imploding in 410. So before we get to the Council of Chalcedon, Rome had been sacked by the Visigoths. And the bishop at that point, a man called Leo, had really stepped into the power vacuum because he had a church structure that he was able to use to provide support for the poor who were struggling, to provide some kind of administrative support to hold the city together. So Leo had become really a very, very powerful figure in Rome, and he wanted to extend his authority. And he wrote a document to try and solve the problem of the wills of Christ, of the nature of Christ, how to talk about Christ. It's known as the Tome of Leo, the tome, the Book of Leo. And he sent it to Alexandria and to Constantinople as his contribution to the debate, and nobody paid any attention whatsoever. However, the emperor died, and the empress who carried on in his she managed to hold on to power, Empress Pulcheria. She called a council to try and get this solved. She had rejected monophysitism, tongue too thin, Ruth, and she very much wanted to get this settled and settled in her terms. So she called the council in Chalcedon in 451, and Leo's tome was read there, and it was endorsed there. So Nestorius and Eutyches were both condemned, and what happened at Chalcedon was, rather than producing another creed or adding something to the creed, they produced what they called the definition of Chalcedon. And I put the sort of central part of that on the handout. It's different from a creed because it's less an affirmation of here are a series of statements of faith. It's more a description of things you can and cannot say. So you get Jesus on the one side is fully human, on the other side is fully divine, and we have to be able to say both of these, unmixed, unmingled, but both true. And it's almost, if you like, it's a kind of grammar, it's a boundary for the discussion, the definition of Chalcedon. It says things that actually you can't say them both, but you have to say them both. Unmixed and unmingled and fully divine and fully human and both and of course, it didn't solve things because you get groups on all sides who rejected it and continue today, but it sets a trajectory. It becomes the creed from Nicaea and Constantinople and the definition from Chalcedon have become and have remained the significant statements for what we'd call the great tradition, the main part of the church in East and West. And they've kind of held together. You've got those who go off in different directions. You've got the monophysites. There's continuing monophysite church. There's continuing Arian church. There's groups who don't accept these. But these two documents together have held together the centre of the church, if you like, within the East and the West. And what they've done is set a here was the way they came up with setting the language about the Spirit, the language about the Trinity. This becomes a very important diagram and remains the diagram to try and explain the Trinity. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. The Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Holy Spirit, the Son is not the Holy Spirit, the Son is not the Father. You can see how it all works together. So if you like, this is another of these, here's a grammar, here's a way of speaking. You can say this, you can't say that, if you're going to stay within this tradition. And what it does is set these two councils together, set three trajectories. It sets the doctrinal trajectory for the church. Both the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedonian definition remain normative for what we call the great tradition of the church. It also set a trajectory of church power. The way in which the Tome of Leo becomes so important at Chalcedon underlines the importance of the Bishop of Rome to speak for and to the Western Church. And it solidifies a split between the Latin and the Greek churches, because the language here begins to separate. And it also sets the trajectory of political power, the role of the ruler in shaping the church. All of these councils were called by the emperor. And the emperors, or the empress in the Chalcedon case, play a really significant part in what the decision is in the end. And I just have to say, if you've been listening to the religious arguments around what's going on at the moment between Russia and Ukraine, some of what's going on we see starting here. The place of the bishop in shaping the political power, but also the place of political power in determining the shape of the church. And there's the understanding of the way in which orthodoxy owns a territory has some of its origins in this part of church history. I haven't got time, to be honest, but I also haven't got enough skill to go into that. But it's what's happening now has its roots then. I want to put us into groups for, where are we? 5 or 6 minutes, just to think about a hymn that you've sung recently. And to think about what is the language that the hymn was using about Jesus? And did it emphasize humanity or divinity? What kind of terms were used? And what does the balance say to you about how we speak of Jesus? Because this is still a debate that we're having. How do we speak about Jesus? How do we speak about the different claims about who he is? So there was a request on the chat to see the diagram again. So I'm sorry I missed it beforehand, but here it is.
Yes, thank you. Much appreciated.
That's fine. Actually, it's a very helpful lead into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is just moving on to a discussion of how people talked about the Trinity. Because the nature of Christ is not the only issue, of course, that the church was having to deal with. It was, how do you talk about God as three and one? So this diagram is quite a useful way into thinking about that. So thank you. Just flip us through. Whoops. So last week we talked a little bit about Tertullian. Tertullian was a Latin speaker, and he was one of the first, or he is the first, to use the term Trinitas, which becomes for us, we are part of the Western Church, becomes part of our language of Trinity. And he also used the term persona, person, and substantia, substance. So persona refers to the threeness, and substantia to the oneness of God. In the East, we have three wonderful, I mean, I hope you're appreciating these. They're icons, they're clearly not portraits, but they're just glorious pictures, so I thought I'd just put them up. They're known as the Cappadocian Fathers. There's Gregory the Great and Basil, their brothers, and then Gregory of Nyssa, who's their best friend. And they're all theologians, they're all priests, they're bishops, they are working, and they work various things theologically, but they work particularly around how do we talk about Trinity. A fascinating group, actually. Macrina, who is the older sister of Basil and Gregory, she turned her estate into a monastery, and she nurtured community and learning, and they must have been just getting together over coffee. They must have the most fascinating family discussions. But anyway, the three of them worked, and actually what these three were particularly concerned about was how to bring Arians back into the Nicene faith. And so they wanted to, using the Nicene Creed position, using the Chalcedonian definition, but they wanted to find language that would talk about the threeness of God, that would avoid the accusation of tritheism, which was where Arius had started. And so they were trying to find a way of talking not just about Jesus, but about the Spirit and about God as Trinity in a way that would speak both of threeness and oneness, rather as Tertullian was trying to do as well. And so their terms, and they're speaking in Greek, triada, recognize that, I'm sure, the link. And they talked about hypostasis, persons, and ousia, substance. Now those are the Greek equivalents to Tertullian's persona and substantia. But if you are anything of a linguist, you may spot that there was already going to be a problem. Remember, Tertullian is talking about substantia, or what the Cappadocians are calling ousia, but actually, if you simply translate directly, substantia translates hypostasis. And this causes a problem, because the Greeks and the Latins hear each other saying the wrong thing. The Greeks hear the Latins using language of oneness, where they would expect threeness, and the Latins hear the Greeks using the language of threeness, where they would expect oneness. They were trying to say the same thing. They were trying to talk about God as one and as three, as substance and as persons, but because the language, because the way the language was working, they were hearing people, they were hearing each other wrongly. And this further splits the East and the West. And it's reinforced because actually there is a different emphasis that comes out from East and West about the nature of Trinity. For Tertullian and for those who follow on from him, the three persons, if you like, are the I was going to say the origin. It's not. That's not right. Are the all right. When you look at God, you see the three persons, and you then begin to understand that this is one God, says the Western Church. The Eastern Church works the other way around. When you look at God, you see the oneness, and you then discover there's the three persons. So if you like, the emphasis, they're saying the same thing, but the emphasis is different. The emphasis in the West is on the threeness, which is then explored as oneness, and the other way around in the East, the oneness and then the threeness. And the mistrust and the difficulty of language and so on begins to solidify a split that we'll talk next time about Augustine, and we'll see a way in which that actually gets embodied in language and becomes a split. That remains between the Western Church and the Eastern Church in terms of creedal statements. But so much of this is not just the theology, and I think that's the thing I really want to get to tonight. It's not just the theology, it's also the power. It's the power and the politics. It's who has the right to call a council? Who has the right to dictate what a council will come up with, the conclusion? Who is the primary speaker on behalf of the church? Is it Rome? Is it Alexandria? Is it Constantinople? Where does the power lie, and what is that power based on? And when you add into that the struggles of language, what you end up with is actually a division in the church that mirrors the division of the empire. So you've got the Eastern Empire, which has a strong political centre at Constantinople, and therefore is holding together, and therefore the church, in a sense, doesn't have to hold it together. And so you get Alexandria and Constantinople and various other towns as well, all having an equal say, really, and they're debating around. The churches there are equally powerful in the debates. In the Western Empire, because politically it has fallen apart, the role of the Bishop of Rome in politically holding things together has raised the profile of the Bishop of Rome above the other bishops, and he is trying also to claim authority over the Eastern Empire, but he certainly becomes a very powerful figure in the Western Empire, and we get the beginnings of what we recognise, and we'll talk about in the medieval session. We get the beginnings of the papal monarchy and the political power of the Pope, because there isn't the imperial power which is still present in the East, and which actually becomes more powerful than the bishops. You see what I mean? So as well as talking about the theology today, as well as talking about the importance of the creeds and the councils and all the controversies that were there, it's important to talk about the politics and take on board the politics and the way in which, because of what was happening politically, the church developed in different directions. Next time, Monday, March the 14th, we will talk about Trinity again. We'll look at Augustine, and we'll pick up on, as I say, we're now going to stick very firmly with the Western Church when we talk about Augustine. He's an overarching Western theologian, but we'll look more at how this split just solidifies and remains one that we're still trying to deal with. I'm going to take the share off. We have 4 minutes. 4 minutes. If anybody wants to feedback on what was going on in the discussion, or wants to ask a question of something that I have, because I have gone so fast today, I'm aware that I'm speaking fast, but also I'm covering rather not a lot of material in a very short period. I have put on the bottom of the handout 3 more books that you might find helpful. They're not all easy to find, but you might find them. And they're all very different, so they'll give you different insights. But if anybody wants to raise a hand and ask a question or feedback anything from the groups, now's your chance. Because you may all just be completely bamboozled and overwhelmed that you just want to go. I won't be offended if you do. Oh, yes, you won't appear in the spotlight. It's all right for the recording. Oh, somebody's saying about notes. The problem is I haven't got them. The handout is what I've got. I'm speaking to the handouts and the PowerPoints. I'm sorry.
Hello, Ruth.
Peter, yes.
Hello. Did these disagreements ever descend into violence?
Oh yes, yes. From the time of the Arian disagreements, there were riots. There were, when people are being arrested, it's usually because there's civil unrest. So when they were arresting Nestorius and Cyril and so on, it was because there was violence. Yes, it did get horribly violent at times.
Yeah. Ruth, you hinted at something to do with, this affecting the Ukraine situation today. I mean, can you just kind of like tell us what kind of in a sort of nutshell what you're sort of getting at?
Okay.
Because we weren't sure in our breakout group. We were going, what did you mean?
I think I could get this very badly wrong. So what I will do is, I have a friend who has worked for World Council of Churches, and he has recently been pointing out that the Patriarch in Moscow has been supporting what Putin is doing from a theological point of view. Now, I don't want to say any more than that at this point. What I will do is get his little write-up, and I will put it into next week's
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Next week's handout, because I think it is really important. And I read it through and thought, yeah, we need to know this stuff, and then realised I haven't got the details, and I don't want to get it wrong because I think it's too important. So I will as an appendix on the handout next week and next time.
Okay, thank you.
Raised a question about the handouts. They have come out. Let me just, there was a question there. Where to access the handout? It has come with the reminder that comes from Eventbrite. So if you don't get the reminder from Eventbrite, you're not getting the handout. If you're not getting that, but I'm not sure how else you're getting linked in, you could email me directly and I could send it to you. I will put my email in the chat. Okay, so. Yeah, okay. Elizabeth.
Yes, I've just put it on. Oh, am I mute? No, yes, I'm not.
Yes,
muted.
you're fine.
Okay. Yes, I've just put it on the chat that Giles Fraser's written an article on the spiritual basis that I was looking at yesterday, and that the Archbishop Nikitos of the Greek Orthodox Church strongly disagrees with it. It's a very interesting discussion, and there's an article in the Spectator as well on it.
And somebody has also said, does the Patriarch of Moscow have any choice about supporting Putin? And that's a really important question. That's part of the whole issue to do with the, I mean, regardless of Putin himself, it's also the relationship between church and state in Russia is different from the relationship between church and state in England. And it has very different historic roots, which actually we've been looking at. So it's a very complicated thing, but I'll try and put something in the next handout.
Thanks.
But thank you for that about Giles Fraser. I saw a little bit of that. Yeah. Anybody else? I'm not sure where the Giles Fraser. It was in the Guardian, but I'm not sure where you'd get it now.
I think just Google it.
Google Giles Fraser. Yeah,
it comes up on quite a lot of websites.
I think I certainly saw a link to it on Facebook. I think it's.
Mhm.
I think people have picked it up, so you might find it on social media. Friends, it is 9:01, which is better than I did last time. Thank you very much. It's been lovely to be with you. I hope you found it useful, and I will see as many of you as can make it again on 14th of March when we will talk about Augustine.